Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the possibility that the White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, might be sidelined after her embarrassing tell-all interview with Chris Whipple in Vanity Fair, and that as a result, the Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, might gain more power and influence, although he is arguably already the second most powerful person in the White House. Joining us for a profile of the dark force behind the indiscriminate roundup of immigrants and the revival of the paranoid politics of the McCarthy Red Scare era is Greg Sargent, a staff writer at the New Republic and the host of the podcast The Daily Blast. A seasoned political commentator with over 2 decades of experience, he was a prominent columnist and blogger at the Washington Post from 2010 to 2023, and is the author most recently of An Uncivil War, Taking Back Our Democracy in an Age of Disinformation and Thunderdome Politics. We will discuss his latest article at the New Republic, Inside Stephen Miller's Dark Plot to Build a MAGA Terror State. Then, since the majority of young Americans reject today's capitalism, we'll do a deep dive into the history of capitalism, which is more of a fact of life than an ideology, with the irony that the former communist Soviet Union, now Russia, and today's communist China are among the most ruthless, unequal, and rapacious capitalist societies on Earth. Joining us is Sven Beckert, the Laird Bell Professor of History, co-chair of the program on the study of capitalism, and co-chair of the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History at Harvard University. He has written widely on the economic, social, and political history of capitalism. His book, Empire of Cotton, won the Bancroft Prize and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and was named one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times. His new book, just out, is Capitalism, A Global History. And before we begin, for over a decade, we have warned that Trump is both a criminal and likely a traitor, not to mention he's mentally unstable, egomaniacal, woefully ignorant, wildly incompetent, insatiably greedy, and corrupt. Now it should be clear to all that his chaotic misrule must be ended as soon as possible, and until that happens, Background Briefing will continue to investigate and expose MAGA criminality and cruelty, but more importantly, explore strategies and popular movements to bring about regime change as quickly as possible to restore democracy and civility and stop the systematic destruction of the United States at home and its standing abroad. To help sustain us with public broadcasting and freedom of the press itself under assault as Trump's billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media, you can make a tax-deductible donation to our nonprofit foundation, the Public Truth Media Foundation, at publictruthmedia.org or at backgroundbriefing.org/donate. And thank you. And joining us now is Greg Sargent, a staff writer at the New Republic and the host of the podcast The Daily Blast, a seasoned political commentator with over 2 decades of experience. He was a prominent columnist and blogger at the Washington Post from 2010 to 2023, and is the author most recently of An Uncivil War, Taking Back Our Democracy in an Age of Disinformation and Thunderdome Politics. And his latest article at the New Republic is Inside Stephen Miller's Dark Plot to Build a MAGA Terror State. Welcome to Background Briefing, Greg Sargent.
Thank you.
So, Greg, your latest podcast at the Daily Blast is about the White House press secretary going through a torturous gymnastics to spin a way out of the revelations in Chris Whipple's interview with the White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, published by Vanity Fair. So without getting into the Washington game of who's up and who's down, is it possible or likely that if Susie Wiles is sidelined by Trump, she's after all the Chief of Staff, the Deputy Chief of Staff is Stephen Miller, would he therefore become even more powerful than he is?
Well, I don't know if Stephen Miller can become more powerful than he is. He's extremely powerful right now. By most accounts, he's got something close to unfettered control over the entire immigration agenda of the Trump administration. He's giving direct orders to top people at Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He's directing what seems to be the military operations in cities. At least he has some key role in that, probably an unprecedented role for someone in the White House. And sure, if Susie Wiles were to be displaced, which I think is unlikely, yeah, I guess Stephen Miller could amass even more power. But man, does he have enough power as it is?
Well, we learned from the Hegseth mistake of the group chat before they bombed Yemen that at the end of that group chat, it's Stephen Miller that actually orders the bombing of Yemen, of the Houthis. So I'm wondering whether tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern, Trump is going to make an address to the nation, whether he won't declare war on Venezuela necessarily, but maybe he'll announce some kind of military action. Miller, of course, if it's anything like Yemen, he's the guy that could pull the trigger. I mean, that is in itself pretty. He overruled Vance in that conversation.
Yes, I think there's very likely going to be an escalation against Venezuela, whether Trump announces it or not. And clearly, Stephen Miller's fingerprints are all over that. It does seem like Stephen Miller is deeply involved in the illegal bombing of quote unquote drug boats that we've been seeing. And that's potentially war crimes that we're seeing there. And I think it's highly plausible that Stephen Miller is directing those, if in some sense, for sure. He's certainly involved in the decision making on it. He's got a vision of the relationship between the United States and the Americas more broadly that is clearly being implemented here. And it's a terrible vision, and it should concern us all pretty deeply. I think it's going to get a lot worse as well.
So, in a nutshell, the vision is that we want to get rid of all the brown people in this country.
Well, he's implementing what you might call a kind of carving up of the globe. China gets its sphere, Russia gets its sphere. Russia and the United States now seem to be much more in alignment when it comes to matters involving Europe. And Donald Trump gets to do whatever the hell he wants in the Americas, including summary executions in international waters. And that's what they are, by the way. They are summary executions. Donald Trump is executing people illegally. It's now up in the 90s, the number. And they don't even seem to feel any pressure or responsibility to justify this legally in any sense.
So let's turn to your article, Greg Sargent, Inside Stephen Miller's Dark Plot to Build a MAGA Terror State at the New Republic. It starts out talking about Miller's ancestors first arriving in the United States in 1903, coming from Belarus. I guess the great-grandfather was the first to arrive, and he worked hard like immigrants did in those days.
Great-grandfather, I believe.
Oh, great-grandfather, so yeah.
Yes.
They came with nothing. They managed to scrape together enough money to bring the rest of the family. Incidentally, those that didn't leave this small town in Belarus ended up being murdered by the Nazis. So what happened to Stephen Miller then in terms of his family tree? He's absolutely, everything he's done is an insult to his ancestors.
Well, what we write in this piece, and people can read it at newrepublic.com. It's a long piece, but we hope that it's rewarding if you put in the effort and time. What we report in there is that Stephen Miller is using rhetoric about today's immigrants that's really quite similar to the type of rhetoric that was used against his ancestors and people like them. He's descended from Russian Jews who came to the United States in the early 1900s as part of the Great Migration from 1880 through 1924, roughly, or maybe through World War One. And at the time, those people from Southern and Eastern Europe were treated as fundamentally unassimilable into the United States. They were treated as people and described widely as people who were unfit to partake in American democracy and the American experiment, unfit to participate in the civilization that the United States was on the path to becoming. And we went through a lot of Stephen Miller's current claims and found that his claims about people from the third world are very similar to those same claims. He treats them as unassimilable and fundamentally unfit to participate in the current United States experiment, which he depicts as an inheritance of Western civilization. So yes, it's a massive betrayal. And in fact, we even quote his own cousin on his father's side saying that it is a massive betrayal of the family tree and the family history.
And the Immigration Act of 1924, which closed the door on immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe and Belarus, etc. Miller has spoken very positive about this 1924 law, which basically, shut the door on his ancestors.
That's right. He has spoken positively about it in emails to Breitbart that were obtained by the Southern Poverty Law Center. I should say, though, that he tends to speak about the 1924 law not in the sense that he says, okay, it's good that all these people were kept out at the time, although he actually comes kind of close to saying that. It's more, he uses it as a device for saying what he thinks should be happening in the present, which is either turning off migration pretty much entirely or imposing new ethnic quotas on it. And now we've got Donald Trump out there saying that he's pausing or stopping migration from the quote unquote third world, which is, in a sense, imposing ethnic quotas, putting ethnic quotas back at the center of immigration policy. He's even privileging white South Africans for refugee status. So yeah, Stephen Miller and Donald Trump are placing ethnic engineering at the center of immigration policy again.
Well, it is, of course, pretty clear that there's no escaping the racism of getting rid of refugee admissions and cutting it down from 125,000 under Biden to 7,500. And most of them, if not all of them, are coming from white Afrikaners coming from South Africa. So I think that is pretty clear what's happening there. So let's talk a little bit about what shaped the sort of racist views, because I think it's fair to say this guy is a racist on steroids. And he said, if you import the third world, you become the third world. He said that in the presidential campaign of 2024. His mentor, I happen to know, David Horowitz, who married a friend of mine, and he was a sort of a prodigal son from the left, having been the editor of Ramparts during the Vietnam War era. And of course, if you're a prodigal son from the left, the right-wing wallets open up to you. So he became quite influential in the right-wing movements, and he mentored Miller, I think, starting when Miller was at Santa Monica High School, right?
Yes, that's right. And Santa Monica was when Stephen Miller started to form some of his early views. It was a diversifying school, and he was railing against multiculturalism even back then. And what we report in this piece is that, according to Steve Bannon, 3 of his leading intellectual influences are Oswald Spengler, Samuel Huntington, and Pat Buchanan. Which, the 3 of them are kind of loosely associated with a way of thinking about Western civilization that treats multiculturalism, globalization, mass migration as an existential threat to the quote-unquote Western inheritance. So we talk about this at some length in the piece, and I'm glad you singled out that quote, if you import the third world, you become the third world. That's Miller, because I think that's one of the most revealing and frankly disgusting things that he has said. It shows a very deep animus towards immigrants from very particular parts of the world that is now at the center of United States immigration policy, and it's a horrible backsliding.
Well, I recall when in Trump's first term, at the very beginning, Miller did sort of do a press conference of sorts, and perhaps he was planning on doing it more often, but he didn't. And in that press conference, he accused one of the reporters of being a cosmopolitan. And that
Right.
was a real flag when I saw that. I thought, my God, where did he find that anti-Semitic trope?
Well, yeah, and we try to engage it in a bit of a different way in the piece. I hope people will read it. It's at newrepublic.com. Um, Cosmopolitanism actually is, in an important sense, one of the inheritances that we get from Western civilization, which, Stephen Miller keeps talking about Western civilization. Well, cosmopolitanism originated with the Stoics in ancient Greece and Rome, was formulated to some degree by the Roman statesman Cicero, was then passed via European intellectuals into today's canon by people like Immanuel Kant and philosophers who also developed cosmopolitanism in other ways. And it's a Western inheritance, and it's far more admirable, I think, a Western inheritance than what Stephen Miller purports to find in the Western canon.
Right, but isn't it what the Nazis referred to as Jews?
Well, I suppose it certainly can be an anti-Semitic trope. I don't want to suggest that Miller means it that way. I think that strays onto turf that is unproven and,
Okay.
Doesn't really necessarily have a basis in things that he's actually said. So, but I think it's bad enough without that connotation, honestly. And I think we should forthrightly defend cosmopolitanism as a better cultural inheritance than anything he purports to find in Western civilization's bequeathment to us.
So just in the last couple of minutes then, let's talk about the public backlash to Trump's mass deportations, which are being engineered by Miller. He's demanding ICE, DHS. He obviously runs it along with Corey Lewandowski and the ICE princesses. Corey Lewandowski's girlfriend, I think she's just decoration, and her recent testimony indicates that she's absolutely clueless. But it's not working for the public. It may be working for Miller, even though he wants 3,000 a day, and they're only getting about at best 1,700 people being rounded up. But the aspect of it that I find that there should be more investigation into is the warehousing of these people in these makeshift private prisons run by CoreCivic and Geo Group. And those big corporations, we don't know how much money they're making, but they warehouse people, they charge the taxpayers for really bad food, etc. So the longer they warehouse these people, the more money they make. And it is so cruel, the conditions are hideous. And we know that Tom Homan, who's basically in charge of the whole game, he accepted $50,000 in cash, and he still hasn't coughed it up, what he did with that money. He's very tied in with these characters who run these big private prisons. So given the nature of Tom Homan's corruption, you would think that this is something that should be investigated. A lot of taxpayers' money is being pilfered, I assume, by this private prison industry.
Well, I will say that hasn't really been my focus. My focus has been more on the policy side of it. And absolutely, I agree that more oversight of where that money is going will be essential. And I imagine that if Democrats take back the House, as seems likely for now, there will be extensive oversight into it, and God knows what will be unearthed. But the point I try to make in this piece that I still think is not central enough in our discussions of this stuff is that it isn't about public safety. It is the opposite of doing something about public safety. Stephen Miller is diverting immense amounts of federal law enforcement resources into his deportations away from serious crimes like child trafficking and drug trafficking. And so essentially, if you really boil it all down, you've got Stephen Miller prioritizing the ethnic and re-engineering of this country over public safety. He's cranking immense amounts of resources into his mass deportation agenda, and all he cares about is hitting certain numbers. He wants to get as many people out as possible who come from the quote-unquote wrong places. And So what you've got here is him diverting resources away from public safety and towards ethnic engineering. And I think if the American people understood this better than is widely understood now, they would absolutely recoil at it.
And we haven't even got to talk about the National Security Presidential Memo number 7, which I think people like you and me could well be targeted by Stephen Miller.
Well, anything's possible. He went out and said that he's been talking about investigations into the radical left and cracking down on the radical left, and then there's a whole set of tenuous claims that come out of the administration about how the left is responsible for this or that act of violence. And so, this is what I would say about that, though. I think his whole threat to come after people on the left is fizzling in a big way. Now, I don't want to, I don't want to place too much confidence in this, but it sure looks like they're having a lot more trouble building the types of cases they were hoping to make than it first appeared.
Well, Greg Sargent, I appreciate you joining us here today.
Well, thanks so much. Always good to talk to you.
Well, thank you, Greg. And again, I've been speaking with Greg Sargent, who's a staff writer at the New Republic and the host of the podcast, The Daily Blast, a seasoned political commentator with over 2 decades of experience. He was a prominent columnist and blogger at the Washington Post from 2010 to 2023, and is the author most recently of An Uncivil War, Taking Back Our Democracy in an Age of Disinformation and Thunderdome Politics. And his latest article at the New Republic is Inside Stephen Miller's Dark Plot to Build a MAGA Terrorist State. We're going to take a brief station break, and since a majority of young Americans reject today's capitalism, we'll do a deep dive into the history of capitalism.
The immigration scene, shining and feeling clean. Could it be a sin? I got stopped by the immigration man. He said he doesn't know if he can let me in. Let me in. Immigration man, can I cross the line and break? I can stay another day. Let me in, immigration man. I won't tow your line today. I can't see it anyway. There he was with his immigration face.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Sven Beckert, who is the Laird Bell Professor of History, co-chair of the Program on the Study of Capitalism, and co-chair of the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History at Harvard University. He has written widely on the economic, social, and political histories of capitalism. His book, Empire of Cotton, won the Bancroft Prize, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and was named one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times. His new book, just out, is Capitalism, A Global History. Welcome to Background Briefing, Sven Beckert.
Good to be here, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And at your university, the Harvard Youth Poll just came out about a week ago, which found that amongst Gen Z, that's the generation aged between 18 and 29, only 13% think that the future is going to work out for them, that the country isn't going in the right direction. And only 39% believe or support capitalism. So what does that say for the future, particularly of American politics?
Look, I think it's hard to tell, but obviously it is an expression of contemporary discomforts and also contemporary economic problems, especially among young people. And I think it should be a call to have that we need to do something about the world that we live in, that we can't continue the way that we have structured our economic lives in the past few years, which has resulted, for example, in tremendously increasing social inequality, and it has also led to huge environmental problems. And it has led to entire regions of the country experiencing deep economic problems. But look, I think, to have this conversation, I think the starting point of this conversation is that we first need to kind of come to terms with the world that we live in. And one of the most important things about the world that we need to understand is that we live in a world of capitalism, that capitalism structures some of the largest processes which we inhabit today, the way we labor, the way we organize our consumption, the way how we live, and also some of the most intimate parts of our lives. And this capitalism, we need to come to terms with it. We need to understand what it is. We need to understand how we got to where we are right now. And I think the best way to do so is to look at how capitalism actually unfolded in history, how we actually got to the point where we are right now. And for that, it's extremely helpful to have a sense of the long history of capitalism as it unfolded over the past 500 years.
So your book suggests that capitalism is a relatively new phenomenon, but 2,000 years ago, according to the New Testament, Jesus Christ went into the temple and, I think on a rare occasion, lost his temper and drove the money changers out of the temple. So if they were changing money back then, was that a form of capitalism?
No, I don't think this was a form of capitalism. I think we have to be very careful to distinguish that on the one hand, there is a kind of logic to economic life under capitalism. And this logic it has existed for a very long time in some parts of the world, but on the margins of economic life. It was a logic that very few people embraced. It was a logic that very few people organized their economic lives around. And these were principally long-distance merchants. So they go back a long time, and maybe they go back 2,000 years, but they lived in a world which was decisively not structured along the capitalist logic. They lived in a world in which most people engaged in subsistence agriculture. They lived in a world in which many people were part of tributary economies, like in feudal Europe, in which the feudal lord expropriated whatever surplus these peasants were able to produce. And this capitalist logic was really quite at the margins of economic life. And now if we fast forward 1,000 years or 2,000 years, namely to the present, to the year 2025, we see that in our world today, almost all of economic life is structured around this logic. Many aspects of our more intimate personal lives are structured along this logic. And the book, in a way, what the book does is try to explain how did we get from a world in which this logic was confined to very few people in very few parts of the world to a logic that now structures almost all of our lives almost completely.
So then do we start with capitalism in the form which it's evolved into now, you say 500 years ago? Would that be the discovery of the New World and essentially the plundering of the New World for resources?
I think that did play an important role in the expansion of capitalism. This logic that we talked about is basically a logic in which people own capital and invest that capital productively in order to increase their capital, so to accumulate more capital. And as I said, this logic was largely confined to long-distance traders who emerged not just in Europe, but also in Africa, in the Arab world, in India, in China. But what happened in the late 15th century and early 16th century, so around the year 1500, what happened is that this logic was now increasingly pushed beyond the realm of trade and was pushed into agriculture, into agrarian production, and eventually it was also pushed into manufacturing, into industrial production. And of course, one of the places where this logic was most radically pushed into the countryside and into agriculture was in the New World. It was in the Caribbean, it was in South America, and later also in North America, because these were parts of the world in which capital owners, these long-distance merchants, were unusually powerful. They encountered unusually weak resistances, and they were able to reinvent the world anew. They were able to reinvent the world along the lines of the economic logic that they had embraced for a long time. And one of the ways how they did so was by creating the plantation economy that would structure the New World. Of course, they also pushed their capital into the, let's say, in the European countryside or into the Chinese countryside, where there was also a greater degree of commercial production, and the logic of capitalism entered those countrysides as well. But in some ways, in the most radical way, at the earliest state, it entered the countryside in the Americas.
So, but also across the other side of the world, the East India Company, which was both Dutch and English, you were in fact practically states unto themselves, and they created the spice trade, which was a way to, because there was no refrigeration in the summer, and also slavery became an adjunct, did it not?
Yes, so the Caribbean is kind of one example for the early capitalist revolution. But of course, as you say, European merchants also expanded into West Africa to engage in the slave trade, but they also then engaged in trade in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and in China. And in a way, as you know, the very reason of why European merchants departed the old world was not so much to find the Americas, because they didn't know about the Americas, but the reason they departed the old world was to find a new way to reach Asia, where they knew that tremendous riches are awaiting them. And in some ways, there, this situation was quite different from the Americas, because they were powerful. These European merchants encountered powerful local merchant communities. They encountered powerful merchants on the western coast of India, for example, or in southern China, and they engaged with trade in trade with those communities. But also, they increasingly tried to gain greater control of production, of this agrarian production that we talked about earlier. And at times they often failed, because these merchant communities and also the local political communities that they encountered in Asia were quite powerful, but sometimes they also succeeded. And there's this amazingly terrifying example of the Banda Islands, which is now in Indonesia, and about which I write in some detail, where the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, wanted to dominate not just the trade in spices, but they wanted to dominate the production of spices. And so what they did is they basically killed the local power holders on these islands. They enslaved many of the locals to other islands in what later became Indonesia, and they imported enslaved workers from other parts of Asia in order to completely dominate spice production. So there's something, broadly speaking, similar happening in the Banda Islands to what, let's say, happens on the island of Barbados or Jamaica. But it was rather exceptional, because much of the expansion of European capital into Asia happened in forms of trade, and also in forms of the interactions between local traders, local merchants, and European merchants. And this, makes maybe illustrates one important point of the book, namely, much of the history about capitalism, as we have learned it in school and how we have encountered it in the past, has been a history that was almost exclusively about Europeans and about the European continent. You all know these stories that start in Florence or Venice and Genoa, then continue into Amsterdam, London, Manchester, maybe New York City, but they almost completely leave out most of the world's people. And one of the core arguments of my book is that you cannot even begin to understand capitalism without understanding it from a global perspective. And indeed, I argue that capitalism was born global, and at all moments of its history, even at its most Eurocentric moments of its history, it can only be understood from such a global perspective.
But then with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, didn't it become more concentrated in Europe, the United States, and I guess to a small extent Japan?
Yes, later in Japan. Yes, no, that's absolutely true. So we see that in the course of the 18th century, this logic of economic life concentrates increasingly on the European continent, and also Europe becomes a much more dynamic economy. It becomes also much, much wealthier than any other part of the world. And this is an important, one of the most important questions that we need to explore when we think about the history of global capitalism. And I do so in the book in some detail. I tell that history of European industrialization, sometimes from very local perspectives. I talk about Scottish entrepreneurs who built the first cotton enterprises. I talk about workers from the Scottish Highlands entering these cotton enterprises. And then I look also more broadly at the process of industrialization in the United Kingdom, in continental Europe, but also in the United States, of course. But these are kind of local stories, and these are stories, and you're absolutely right, these are stories that are concentrated on the European continent and then also the United States and Japan. But even these stories are deeply embedded within a larger global story. So, for example, the core industry of the Industrial Revolution, as we all know, was the cotton industry. And as we also should know, the cotton industry the European cotton industry drew on a long history of cotton production in South Asia. It drew partly on techniques of cotton production that had first been developed in South Asia. It, of course, as we all know, drew on the cotton that was grown in the Americas and after 1790, in particular the cotton grown by enslaved workers in the United States. And eventually the European cotton industry becomes also deeply embedded in global markets. And indeed, by the mid-19th century already, the most important market for the British cotton industry is to be found in South Asia, in India. So even this very European story, which is really important and which we do need to explain, but even this very European story is embedded in a much larger global context. And we can, again, not even begin to understand that European story without also focusing on the larger global story. And that's what the book very much tries to do.
But Sven, when you talk about the mid-19th century, Karl Marx, of course, Das Kapital came out in that period, and he never referred to capitalism, did he? He referred to political economy.
Yeah. Yes, so that is also interesting. So a new kind of, we can now see, looking at this whole problem from the year 2025, we can now see that this new kind of economic civilization emerged in the past millennium. We can also observe how much it does influence all of our lives today. And that, of course, poses the question of how to explain that and how best to understand that. For contemporaries, they had certainly a sense that there was a kind of accelerating change to economic life in many parts of the world, but they struggled with how to understand that change and how to explain it, and of course they also struggled very much with what to call it. And the people talked about capital and capitalists for a very long time. So these were terms that were much older than the term capitalism. But then in the 1830s, people began to, try to find a word for this economic civilization that now began to dominate their lives in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. And it was first the French who came up with the word capitalism as a kind of name for this strange form of organizing economic activity. And then this word basically traveled into the English language. It traveled to England, it traveled to the United States, it traveled to Germany, it traveled to the Netherlands, to Italy, and many different parts of the world. But it's true that Marx, who was one of the more important analysts of this economic civilization, that he did not use the word capitalism very, very frequently, because he was also writing at a moment when the kind of depth of the economic revolution that was produced by the advent of capitalism was relatively fresh. And he struggled with how to best understand that. And, the way how this civilization was understood and how to call it was still quite fluid at the moment at which Marx wrote. And of course, Marx, like Adam Smith or Max Weber or other of the many people who have written on capitalism, they look at this strange economic civilization from the vantage point of their own lives. They look at it from a particular moment in time, and they look at it from a particular space. And so Adam Smith, for example, writes really before the advent of industrialization. So he writes about a largely pre-industrial capitalism. Marx writes in the mid-19th century at a moment when there is an industrial capitalism, but of course, in capitalism that is still quite different from what would then unfold in the 20th century. And they both write, or Max Weber as well, they write from a European perspective because that's where they find themselves, and that's from where they observe this new economic logic taking on such great importance in human life. And all of them are important observers of this history. All of them have important things to say about this history that is still relevant to the present day. But there are also limitations to what they were able to see and how they were able to understand it. And today we are writing about this history from a totally new vantage point. We are writing about this history from the vantage point of 200 more years of the history of capitalism, you know, the advent of mass production, the advent of the welfare state, and all kinds of really important things that happened. But we also write about this history today from the vantage point of a world in which clearly the most dynamic sectors of the global capitalist economy are to be found in Asia. And so no one in their right mind would think about capitalism today and exclusively focus on the continent of Europe. Indeed, you would completely misunderstand the history of capitalism if you would do so. But instead, we must look at capitalism today from a global perspective. And I think that's largely uncontroversial. But that to me also suggests that if we look at capitalism's history, we need to bring the lessons of today into the study of the past and also think about it from a global perspective in the long historical framework.
So the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci called the 20th century's interwar era a time of monsters. That's from 1918 to 1945. And of course, that period includes the Bolshevik Revolution. And the irony is, of course, today, when you talk about capitalism being global, and you mentioned China, China and Russia, both post-communist countries, have perhaps the most ruthless form of capitalism on the planet in many ways. I mean, it's, it's a kleptocracy in Russia, and, the Chinese have to work incredibly hard, largely for the glory of the country, but basically don't have much time off. They work incredibly hard, and now you've got massive youth unemployment and a lot of discontent. So how would you, the communist era, of course, in a way, certainly the Soviet communism was, I suppose you could make the case that it was a political, military, police state pretending to be an economy. How would you describe it?
Look, I study 1,000 years of history, and I study almost the entire world, and but I do draw some boundaries around my object of study, and the boundaries that I draw is that I try to focus to the best of my ability to understand this capitalist revolution, this massive change in human affairs. And there is certainly an important and interesting history about the communist world and about China and about the Soviet Union, but I leave that out of the book. It's not part of the story of the book. Perhaps only in so far as, of course, the Soviet Revolution of the early 20th century was an important presence also in the capitalist world throughout the 20th century. It created a lot of tensions within Western societies as well, and of course, then with the end of Soviet communism in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we see how these societies transition very rapidly to a form of capitalism as well. So we see a kind of territorial expansion of capitalism in the 1980s and 1990s that is really quite important to understanding also our contemporary world. And of course, the form of capitalism that, let's say, as you mentioned, that emerged in post-Soviet Russia, or the form of capitalism that emerged, let's say, in post-communist Hungary, these are forms of capitalism that are distinctly different from, let's say, Swedish capitalism or capitalism in the United States. And yes, they do have some of the features that you mentioned. But I think what also needs to be said is that capitalism comes in all kinds of varieties and in all kinds of flavors. It has changed drastically over time. The capitalism of 2025 United States is very different from the capitalism of the 1950s, and that's very different from the capitalism of the 1850s in the United States. And of course, also at any given moment, capitalism is rather diverse. The capitalism of Barbados in 1750 is very different from the capitalism of the United Kingdom in that same year. So capitalism has always created a variety and great diversity, and these varieties and these diversities have always been connected to one another. And that, I think, partly explains the very dynamic of the capitalist revolution, which is quite astounding in word historical terms. And it also shows something else that is really important about capitalism, namely that capitalism is rather undogmatic. Unlike many people who write about capitalism, capitalism itself is rather undogmatic, and it has led, to a whole variety of particular forms, particular labor regimes, particular territorial forms, to particular forms of political rule, as you mentioned, that different political regimes in which it was embedded. So capitalism has created great variety, for better or for worse, and it presumably is going to continue to do that also into the future.
Well, Sven, I brought it up because Soviet communism and communist China, or communism in China, which I think is hardly an apt description of what is really happening there. It's a communist government, but a capitalist economy. The point is that they were supposed to be an alternative to capitalism, but it clearly hasn't worked out. And it leads you to ask the question, is capitalism an ideology, or is it a fact of life?
I think it is both. I think you're right that the word now is mostly a word in which that capitalist economic logic dominates human life. I think that is true, and it's in that way it is a fact of life. But again, it's not natural. It's historical. It has a beginning. It has a moment of its emergence. We can see how it spreads through space and through society. So in that way, it's not something that existed throughout human history. And of course, as we also have discussed, it has changed quite dramatically over time, and presumably it's going to continue to change into the future. And of course, the change in capitalism is not just a fact of the logic that we spoke about earlier. It's not kind of a machine that develops in a certain way and there's nothing we can do about it. It's just the way how the world works. But the particular forms that capitalism has taken in the past, or the great varieties of capitalism that we see today in the world, are the result of political interventions of the state, of social movements. Once upon a time, plantation slavery was very crucial to global capitalism, and massive social movements and a very bloody civil war in the United States put an end to the importance of plantation slavery. So we see that there are a lot of mechanisms how this capitalism changes over time and can change over time.
It's often said that capitalism is good at creating wealth, but not at distributing wealth. And communism or socialism is not good at creating wealth, but is good at distributing wealth. So does that mean that the sweet spot between capitalism and socialism is social democracy, like you have in the Scandinavian countries and in some parts of Europe?
Look, I don't know, but I think you're absolutely right. Capitalism has led to an increase in human productivity that is completely unparalleled in human history. Like almost everything around you right now is a kind of result of the capitalist revolution. We live in a world of unbelievable plenty, something that could not even have been dreamt of 200 years ago. And so this is important to acknowledge. And I think also, as you mentioned, capitalism has gone along with very severe inequalities. Of course, capitalism did not invent inequality. I mean, there was inequality in the world before the advent of capitalism, but of course, capitalism has produced enormous social inequalities, and the United States today is certainly an example for a society that is particularly unequal. But then, there are moments in the history of capitalism in which inequality has been much less, as you also mentioned, and you mentioned the Scandinavian countries, which is certainly true. But it's also true for the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, which saw much lesser degrees of social inequality than we see today. So I don't think the question of inequality is just, to point to another part of the world and say, oh, they know how to do it, because I think we did know once upon a time also how to address some of these issues.
Well, just to continue our sweep and ride through history, Sven, you cover the Keynesian order, and then that's supplanted by the neoliberal order. Yeah. So just touch on those two briefly.
Yeah, so one of the arguments of the book is that, of course, change in capitalism is continued. So every year we produce a little bit more people go to work in factories, we consume a little more, there is technological progress. So this is kind of continuous throughout the history of capitalism and is, of course, something that sets the capitalist civilization apart. But then sometimes capitalism is also a kind of social order, an institutional order. And this institutional order can be quite stable for relatively long time periods before then suddenly changing. And one example for such a institutional order in capitalism that I see is what I call the Keynesian economic order of the 1950s, 1960s into the 1970s, which was an order in which the state played an important role in economic regulation, in which trade unions played an important role in redistributing the wealth that was produced in industry. This was a moment in which there was much less social inequality. This was a moment when the welfare state expanded tremendously in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. And this order, as we all know, came into a crisis in the 1970s. It came into an economic crisis at a moment of high inflation, high unemployment, slower economic growth, slower productivity growth. But also it came into crisis because it encountered movements of the left and the right that opposed this particular institutional framework. And something else emerged. And I think that what emerged after the Keynesian economic order is what I call the neoliberal order, which was, again, characterized by a different relationship between the state and capital. It was characterized by massively increasing inequality. It was characterized by a diminished role of industry. It was characterized by a global integration of production, what was called globalization at the point. And it was also characterized by the diminishing importance of industry and industrial capital to capitalism, and the increasing importance, again, of merchants and finance and banking and such things. And I think this order emerged in the 1970s. It didn't have, a name to it yet. And it flourished in the 1990s under Bill Clinton, for example, in the 2000s. But I think now we live in a world in which this order itself is entering its own moment of crisis. And maybe we're living at a moment in which we see the emergence again of a different institutional order in which capitalism lives.
Well, you refer to Chile's dictator Pinochet, as Pinochet was the Lenin of neoliberalism. And it's a bit of an irony, isn't it, Sven, that Pinochet's protege has just been elected the new president of Chile. Right.
And so I have not followed the ins and outs of.
Yeah, well, it's not if I was in Chile, I wouldn't be very happy. But they voted for him, just as the American people voted for Donald Trump twice. So we have to try and wrestle with these things. But just in the last couple of minutes, let's talk about your book in terms of the fact that today we're offering up your book as a gift in support of KPFA in the Bay Area of San Francisco and across Northern California, and at KPFK across Los Angeles and Southern California today. And it's, of course, a pretty hefty book. And what would you be able to tell us or tell our audience, Sven, about why they need your book, which I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and the details are in your book.
Yes, so I think the book is going to help you in a fundamental way to understand the world in which we live in today, a world that is deeply structured by the capitalist revolution. In order to understand the capitalist revolution, you need to understand it from a historical perspective. The book offers a new perspective on how to understand capitalism, namely it tells the story from a global vantage point. And it is a story that it's a story that is told from a global perspective, but it tells also a lot of local stories. It talks about individual entrepreneurs. It talks about particular cities. It talks about particular groups of workers. It's a fast-paced book, which I think is actually an easy read, despite that the topic is rather complicated. But it should also be read, I think, in a way to enable us not just to think about the past anew, but also to use our new understanding of the past to think afresh about the opportunities of the future, and maybe to address some of the pessimism that is now so common in many societies.
Well, Sven Beckert, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian. It was great to talk.
And again, I've been speaking with Sven Beckert, who's a Laird Bell Professor of History, co-chair of the program on the study of capitalism, and co-chair of the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History at Harvard University. He has written widely on the economic, social, and political history of capitalism. His book, Empire of Cotton, won the Bancroft Prize, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and was named as one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times. And his new book, just out, is Capitalism, A Global History. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more light goes out.